Welcome to the Determined Truth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome in. This is the Christmas episode. I don't think we've ever done a Christmas episode. Did we do one last year on this?
No, we didn't do one last year, but I think we have done some in the past.
Okay. It's the first annual, because we'll do it next year again.
Okay.
Maybe. Who knows? Who knows what's happening on the show? For Christmas this year, we want to do a special episode. It is breaking up our Galatians series that we started a couple weeks ago, and we'll pick that up in the new year because we'll take a little bit of a break for the next couple weeks for the holidays. But we wanted to do a special episode because the Christmas message it's critical to the Gospels. And unfortunately, I would say many Christians don't know what to do with the Gospels, like the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, outside of like Christmas and the resurrection and Holy Week. And so the only time they read the Gospels oftentimes is at Christmas. We'll read Luke chapter 2, and then at Holy Week we'll read the Passion Week narratives, and then we don't know what to do everything else in between.
Yeah.
We've already gone through the four Gospels, and we've done a survey, and so we've noted that, hey, no, the Gospels matter. And so this is the opposite for us. This is the time where we actually spent time in the Gospels, and now we're actually going to look at just the birth narrative of Jesus in Luke. I think it's just where we're going to hang out today. But when we look at some of the traditions, especially that we've and ways of looking at the Christ birth narrative, we've snuck in some things that are not necessarily from the biblical story, right?
Yeah, we've adapted the biblical story to fit our modern understanding of how things are, and sometimes we've done a disservice to that. So I preached a number of years ago, Vinnie. We did Advent every year when I was preaching at the church. And so one year I was doing Luke's story, and I preached on the manger scene. And I explained, hey, we'll talk about it a little bit in today's episode. This is not really what's going on, guys. It wasn't a manger like that. And I was explaining the significance of that, which we'll get into in this episode. And I thought, okay, this is really important. And here's the reason why it's important, that this is incorrect, and this is what the story really is about. And one of the elders comes up to me at the end of the service and said, "Why'd you have to ruin my manger scene?" And I'm like, what do you say? I'm thinking, because your manger scene is wrong. I didn't say that.
What you could have said was bah humbug.
Yeah. I just simply said, look, because I'm simply telling you what I think the text says. And this is what the text says, and here's why it's important. It was just interesting, not only that, the whole point was preserving my manger scene and preserving my understanding of Christmas instead of understanding the significance of the Christmas story.
Yeah. Protestants, we're the new Catholics. We have our own traditions that we hold to.
That's an interesting way of putting it. We might lose 15 listeners over that one.
I would challenge,
Yeah,
even in a Baptist church, I challenge people that on yours. I'm like, hey guys, oftentimes we become the new Catholics. We bag on them for their traditions, but how many traditions do we have that we hold to, that we hold as strongly as the canon itself when they're just traditions?
So, absolutely.
Yeah. What do you think this, or at least one of the central themes of the birth story is then? Let's start there.
Sure. So one of the things that I think is correct, that is very common in popular jargon, especially popular evangelical Protestant jargon, is the humility of the birth story. The story is shrouded with humility. And there's a lot of truth to that. John Oprah wrote, I think, actually a really good book titled "Who Is This Man?" And he makes this comment. He says, Jesus entered the world with no dignity. He would have been known as a mamzer, a child whose parents were not married. His cradle was a feeding trough. His nursery mates had 4 legs. That might be questionable. He was wrapped in rags. He was born without dignity. He would die with even less dignity, convicted, beaten, bleeding, abandoned, naked, and shamed. Dignity on the level of a king is the last word you associate with Jesus. Okay, that's great. No problem whatsoever. I think the central concern, however, that I have with regard to the story is that it's a story about God coming down and dwelling among us. And yeah, humility is an important part of the story. Obviously, Philippians 2, 5 through 11. But I think we need to add several elements to the story. First off, the story of the incarnation is the story of God doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. God becomes human, and he does for humanity what humanity did not do, what Adam and Eve did not do. He chose wisdom from God. And that wisdom was, Satan says, I'll give you these things and you don't have to suffer. That's the temptation scene with the devil in the wilderness. And the Father's answer is, I'll give you these things, but you have to go through suffering. And remember, of course, when we get to the Garden of Gethsemane, Father, take this cup from me. I don't want to do it this way. So Jesus does it through suffering and chooses to do what humanity could not do, namely choosing wisdom from God as him as the ruler. But we also have another important aspect, and that is the cross. And of course, I think what we see in the cross, we've discussed this a lot in our study of Revelation and elsewhere, is that it's the power of God exemplified. One of the things I often mention is that when it comes to the problem of evil, and I think the problem of evil is a legitimate problem that we as Christians don't grapple with, we dismiss it too quickly, but that's for another conversation. But one of the things I do say is the greatest answer to the problem of evil is that God knows what it's like to suffer. God suffered on our behalf. The cross is ultimately the greatest answer to the problem of evil. That God suffered for us. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't have to suffer at all, but he took on our suffering and suffered for us. But even then, I think there's just much more. And I think the next element of that is the coming of Christ, the incarnation, the birth story, the Advent season is about the mission of God's people. We talk so often about we are to be who Jesus was. Imitate me as I imitate Christ, as Paul says. But I think we're also supposed to do what Christ did. And therefore, it's important to note that Jesus didn't simply enter humanity in some quiet little stable or barn or manger off in the distance over there, but he did it in the midst of people. Now, it was in the midst of a city like Bethlehem and not Jerusalem, and that'll be important in the story, but it was in the midst of the city of Bethlehem and not distant and where he wasn't welcome in the city. That's the kind of, we'll discuss this a little bit as we proceed, but that's the common folklore. Oh, he wasn't welcome. There's no room for them in the inn and all. And therefore, they're out in some stable, and the only ones that come alongside them are some shepherds and some animals. I don't think that's the correct way to read the story.
Hey, and the wise
look
men.
at it. Yeah. And of course, the wise men come maybe even a couple of years later, right? We don't know. The Gospel of Matthew says they come to the house.
It was that night.
Yeah.
It was that night.
That's what my manger scene says.
I was going to say, it's funny, the gentleman who does the voiceover for the intro to the show, announcing us, it was a guy who I worked with, because when you had me come on, we had to change the intro, and I wasn't going to do it because why am I going to introduce us? So I had a coworker do it. So we're in a small group with his family, and his wife was over the other night. We're doing a Christmas party, and she's looking at our nativity scene, and she's like, why don't they do this normally? Shouldn't the wise men be way over there? Like, she wants to go on the other side of the room. I'm like, oh, you actually nailed it. Good job.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
And there was no star over Bethlehem. That's another, we won't get to there today, but the star led him to Jerusalem. It didn't lead him to Bethlehem.
You are going to ruin everyone's Christmas, Rob.
Yeah, you can't put a star on top of your Christmas tree.
You are an Ebenezer Scrooge.
Yeah.
Okay.
Humbug.
Let's read through it. So we normally read, if anyone's seen the Charlie Brown Christmas, it's from the Gospel of Luke chapter 2 is the beginning of that story. So should we kick it off there?
Sure, absolutely. Let's go 1 through 5. Maybe we'll start with that.
Okay. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus. See, now I'm trying to read it because I've seen Charlie Brown so much. From Caesar Augustus, from Emperor Augustus, that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house of the family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. Oh, I went a little further. Okay.
What translation were you reading from?
NRSV.
Oh, okay. I'm like trying to follow along with that. I thought you had the ESV. Okay,
no,
cool.
I did. I've been switching over.
So again, we discussed a lot in our study of Revelation that the story of the biblical text is a contrast in power. So what you see here is the census is taken, not only means that people have to be counted for taxation, but it also meant to the people that you are subjects of Caesar. You are part of his kingdom. It was a reminder that Rome was in power. And so it might seem like no big deal to us, but when you are Israel and Rome orders a census, it's like, yeah, they're in charge. Now, citizens with property outside their hometown may had to have gone there to register. So it could be, remember Joseph and Mary are up in Nazareth. It could be that Joseph had property in Bethlehem. Or it could be that his birth records were there in Bethlehem because, of course, his family was from Bethlehem, being of the lineage of David. And maybe his family had recently settled in the Galilee. So long story short, the Galilee up in the northern part was settled within the last 100 years at this time by Jewish people. So Jewish people lived in Judea, in that area around Jerusalem, but now they also settled the region of Galilee, and that's why you have Samaria in the middle. And it may have been that Joseph and his family actually went up to Nazareth up in the Galilee, as settlers. And so if he still has family, or if his birth records are there, or if he has land, for some he has to go back to the city of Bethlehem to register there. And it's about a 3-day journey, about 90 miles. It depends on whether they went around Samaria, which they very likely did. If you go from Galilee and then you head to the Jordan River Valley, to head to the east, and then go down the Jordan River Valley, and then you come back up from Jericho up to Jerusalem, and then in Bethlehem, it's about a 90-mile journey. It's about a 3-day, 4.5-day, 4-day journey there. It depends on how exactly you traveled. And the other thing that we'll note is Bethlehem's about 4.5 miles from the city of Jerusalem, southwest of Jerusalem.
Okay. Moving on then, verse 6 now, which I overlapped a second ago.
Okay.
While they were there, the time came for her to deliver a child. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn.
Okay.
And so this becomes one of the first, we hear this and we have we're probably seeing this story through the visuals that we hear, not only in your church on stage, but all over town when you drive around in Coca-Cola commercials, like all the popular culture stuff that has influenced how we understand these things. In the same way where if you think of the Exodus story, you're probably going to think back to the Charlton Heston movie, The 10 Commandments, and you're going to think, oh, that's a literal depiction of everything that happened there. And so this is the way it happened. So we're going to do this. We have these preconceived ideas. So one of the common misconceptions here is like in verse 6, they were there. There is a time for her to deliver her child. It's this idea of you have this uber pregnant Mary coming in on a donkey.
Yes, riding into Bethlehem on the back of a donkey. Hey, we got to have a place because we have to give birth. It says while they were there, which suggests that they had been there for a while. It doesn't tell us how long they had been there, but the notion that Mary and Joseph were traveling on a donkey and she's very pregnant probably doesn't make a lot of sense, because if that's the case, Joseph wouldn't have taken Mary along with her. He might have left her back in Nazareth if she's that far pregnant for whatever reasons. He's got to go to Bethlehem because of the Roman census, but it's probably they were there for, I don't know, weeks, a month or more. Obviously, if she's only 6 months pregnant, maybe she's not as pregnant as we commonly think of those.
And that would be standard way of traveling. When my family goes to Disneyland, we drive from the Bay Area, and it's okay, we know it's 350 miles or whatever it's going to take us X amount of hours to drive. You just get from point A to point B, and you want to get there as fast as possible. And for them, is travel going to be something that is that quick pace, or are they more likely to have leisurely moments where they're traveling and stopping? And what does that look like in the ancient world?
They would have traveled at a fair pace. Of course, they can only travel as fast as the slowest person. So it depends.
And a pregnant woman's probably going to be your slowest person.
Perhaps, or an elderly person. And again, it depends on how pregnant that she was. When you're traveling with a caravan of people, then they're going to tent and have encampments, so they don't need to make it to the next hotel or to the next inn, as we'll discuss here in a little bit. They simply will go as far as they could. But obviously, you have to have provisions while you're out there. And so you don't want to take your time. You want to get there as quickly as you can.
Okay. Let's talk about that. In the NRSV in verse 7, it says there's no place for them in the inn, which is probably a common, that's like the standard way we know how it's rendered. And I have the NIV pulled up, and it says there was no guest room available for them.
Yeah.
That's a vastly different translation. And even there in the inn, I'm thinking of like a roadside hotel or a motel or something like that. What should we think of when we hear this concept of a guest room and an inn and those sorts of things?
Okay, so the idea of an inn comes from William Tyndall. That's how it got into the English language. Yeah, William Tyndall did that. He translated this as an inn. The NIV actually, believe it or not, is one of the few times we're going to, hey, the NIV got it right. I think the NIV got it right. It's a guest room. It says no guest room was available. There's several reasons why we know it's not an inn. First off, there were no inns in Bethlehem. So inns were places for travelers, not for women and children, only for men who are traveling.
Oh.
And they'd be about 16 to 18 miles apart, because that's about a day's journey. So Bethlehem was 5 miles, 4.5 miles southwest of Jerusalem. You're not going to have an inn. Jerusalem's going to be your destination. So you're not going to have an inn 4.5 miles, 5 miles outside of Jerusalem. There were no inns in Bethlehem. There's no archaeological evidence of inns in Bethlehem. There would be an inn from Jerusalem to Jericho, which is about 18 to 20 miles down the mountain and or back up, depending on which way you're going. So Jericho would have an inn, like when the Good Samaritan takes the man who is injured to the inn. And that's the next thing. That is this. Luke knows the word for inn.
He uses
Pandok sign, and he uses it. Yeah, in Luke chapter 10, verse 34.
Because I was going to say, he uses a different word in Luke 10 than he does in Luke 2.
In Luke 2, he uses the word kataluma. And so it's not the same as pandoxion and pandoxion. Pandoxion clearly means an inn, and it's used by Luke. So Luke knows the difference. The next thing is this. We now know from a lot of archaeological discoveries what houses in Bethlehem were like. And a guest room is probably the proper term. In fact, that's the word that's used for the upper room where the disciples eat the Last Supper in Mark's gospel and in Luke's gospel. So it's very likely that it's not an inn. It just doesn't make any sense archaeologically or geographically. It's a guest room.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the popular notions we've probably heard sermons on it. We have this visual of like poor Mary and Joseph walking along. It's cold, it's dark, and they're just knocking on doors, and everyone is just shaming them and not allowing them in. It's this poor thing. And so then they have to settle on going to a barn. Is this kind of what we should be expecting?
This is so far from wrong. It's amazing. Now, again, it fits our modern understanding of the humility of Christ's birth, right? So if we have that narrative, we wrap this into it and go, oh, see, they're shamed because they have a child out of wedlock. Everyone knows because it's family members. They would know that they're not actually married or that they got pregnant before they were actually married. Family would know these things, secrets travel. But the reality is this. First off, hospitality is mandatory in this culture, both then and now. It's a mandatory thing in that culture, especially to a family member or to a member of the clan. And if there's a pregnant woman, and again, we don't know how much she was showing because we don't know how long they had been there, they would absolutely have sensed the responsibility to take her in. They wouldn't be asking questions about, was this conceived out of wedlock? That's a modern stereotype, right? Of what we do in our church is what we shame people there. Furthermore, if Joseph had family in town, they're going to welcome him. And even if he didn't have family in town, and he likely did, the fact that he's related to King David. In other words, if he walks into town and says, hey guys, I am Joseph, the son of Jacob, the son of Matan, the son of Eleazar, the son of Eli, the immediate response is, welcome, what can we do for you? They're not going to ask these questions. Hey, how long have you guys been, have you been married? That's not going to happen. Hospitality is required. If Joseph has family in town, they're going to take him in. And even still, he's a descendant of King David. Therefore, someone is going to have it's simply a requirement of their culture to take that person in and to welcome him. So there's no question that they wouldn't have been shamed into a cave somewhere off in the distant region around Bethlehem.
Hey everyone, we want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast. And we want to remind you that everything we provide at Determined Truth is free of charge. And this even includes all of the teaching that Rob, Danny, and myself do on a weekly basis in our online Bible studies, live streams, and our coaching for pastors in India and around the world. We don't have any supporters who get special behind-the-scenes access, but we can only do this with the generous support from those of you who can afford to give. So if you'd prayerfully consider supporting us with a fully tax-deductible donation, with anything from $5 a month or more, we will continue to challenge the church to be the church. To give, go to determinedtruth.com and click on the Give tab, or find the link in today's show notes. Thanks.
Okay. So there's no room for them then. For whatever reason, they can't find room in the guest room. However, we should translate it, probably guest room. Why is there no room, and why is that significant?
Okay. So it should not be translated there was no room for them in the inn. We would go to no room for them in the guest room. But even then, maybe the better way to translate it, which fits, I think, the context itself, is they had no room in the guest room when it came time for the baby to be born. So here's the deal. They're in a guest room. And now what's happening is this. So archaeologists have discovered a number of first century houses in Bethlehem. Most of these houses were one-room homes, about 250 to 500 square feet, so very small. And the Jewish law forbade a man to sleep in the same room as another man's wife. So what they did then, these one-room homes, they would separate that one-room home with a curtain, a partition of some nature. And the other side of the curtain would be the kataluma, the guest room. So imagine this one-room home. On one side is, maybe it's built up against the cave where the animals are staying, because if you're shepherds or whatever, the animals come in the wintertime and they provide warmth for the home. It's actually heating, even though there's a lot of stank coming with them as well. But you're used to that. You're shepherds. So the animals will be there on the main part of the home, and on the other side of the curtain is the guest room. So when it comes time for the baby to be born, you have other people attending to the woman, helping her give birth. There's simply not enough room on that partition side of the room, on the guest room side. So they move into the main room. There was no room for them in the guest room side of the room. They move it in the other side. The other side's where, if there were animals involved, and we don't know if the animals were out, and the shepherds were out with their flocks by night, it says. So that's the other side of the house there. And this suggests that the home is built up against the cave where the animals are, and that he was simply born in the main part of the home. That's all it is, in the midst of the community. And that's the key thing that I want to stress: in the midst of the community, not shamed on the outskirts of the city.
I was going to say, because that completely reorientates how we think of this, because they're in complete isolation, and the only people who are here they're surrounded by animals. And we know that we have an Advent calendar, right? And so my son has this little Advent calendar, and it's animals and palm trees on his one. And then you have some shepherds, and you have some wise men, and then you have Mary, Joseph, and baby Jesus. So it's just this small pocket of people who knew that, we'll call it, apocalyptic event is happening.
Okay. Now, is your baby Jesus white?
Oh, he's white. This kid has like this kid needs to put on SPF.
It's Joseph, right?
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah.
Sometimes the wise men might be different colored because they're from the east.
Yeah.
But Mary and Joseph are certainly, and baby Jesus is certainly white. Yeah. So the incarnation of Christ, as I said again, is the story about God coming in the midst of humanity. Hebrews 4:15 says that he was tempted in all things as we are, yet was without sin. So somehow we've made the story about the birth of Christ coming in secret, because again, it appeals to our modern individualistic, self-centric mentality of, oh, we have to be humble like Jesus was. And so, sure, he was born in a small town of Bethlehem and not Jerusalem. That's important. He's not born in the capital, but Bethlehem. But he was born in the middle of that city. And I think that's a very important part of the story.
This introduces the theological term that is used of this event called the incarnation.
Yeah.
Right. Of God joining and taking on part of his creation.
Taking on flesh, right? Incarnation. Yeah. Now, there are so many directions we can go with this conversation at this point in time. I think we need to stress, obviously, the story is in the background and the contrast of power. Remember, the Gospel of Luke is focusing on Jesus as the king. John the Baptist is the new prophet, Samuel, who anoints King David. John the Baptist is the new prophet who anoints Jesus. And Roman power and Roman oppression is being contrasted with the rule of Jesus. And we see this throughout the gospel stories, even with the disciples not understanding who Jesus was, or that he's going to suffer. What does he mean, rise from the dead? What does he mean he's going to die? Peter in the Gospel of Mark even takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him because he said he's going to suffer. But the other important element then is the fact of the story of God coming in the flesh, and that's what we're called to do.
Okay, so you've just thrashed our understanding of the manger.
Why'd you ruin my manger scene?
Yeah, we didn't even talk about the manger. So let me ask you this: so it's not some stable that they're in terms of, especially how we look at maybe a 19th, 20th century Americana type barn thing. Yeah, so it's not that. With a manger, you see these all the time. It's going to be these 2x4 looking mangers with hay in it, like something that a horse or cow is going to feed from. Is that what we're looking at as well for the manger?
A manger is a feeding trough. That's all a manger is. So we know that if this home then was up against the cave where animals were, that's great. It's a little feeding trough. I've personally seen some of these actually in Jerusalem. They're carved into the stone. They're maybe a couple feet long and 12 inches wide or whatever, maybe a foot deep or whatever. And it's just a great place to lay a child that's been wrapped in swaddling clothes to keep them basically out of the cold as much as possible. So it does give an indication that there were animals, but not that he was in a cave/manger up in the middle of nowhere, but a home attached to a cave.
Okay. So other misconceptions, we made a joke about wise men earlier about how we see them in the story up here, like that night, there's just 3 dudes who show up. From a timing standpoint, though, is this something that we should expect that they just ended up showing up that night?
Yeah, we don't really know the answer to that question. Of course, we do have this indication. The Gospel of Matthew records them coming to a house. So that indicates that, again, it could be this home here. The second thing, though, is that the wise men, the star led them to Jerusalem. It wasn't a constant star. It was a star that they saw in the east, pointing the direction to where the king was to be born. And it's going to be the king of the Jews. So they went to Jerusalem. Okay. How long it lasted, whether it got them all the reality is they're going to go to Jerusalem because that's what they're expecting. If the star led them to Jerusalem, then the star misled them. If the star is hanging over the city of Jerusalem, I think the star was in the sky saying go in that direction. They go in that direction there. And there's apocalyptic elements to it as well, by the way. We won't even go down that path right now. But what's happening then is they go to Jerusalem. Hey, we're looking for the king of the Jews. Herod's like, it's not my child. The wise men are like, uh-oh, I think we made some trouble here. So when the wise men find out that Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem, they probably notified, hey, we did something that you might want to know about. We let Herod know because we were asking him because that's what we thought. Herod then had all the babies 2 and under slaughtered. And again, that might be about 10 children, 15. How many kids in Bethlehem at that point in time would be under 2 years of age? A very small number, maybe even only a handful. But the fact that it was 2 and under indicates that some time has gone on. It wasn't a newborn babe. It was a babe that was born within, obviously, maybe a year. And maybe Herod's being careful with 2 and under, not the night of his birth. Sorry about that.
From a literary standpoint, should that have us think back to the Exodus story?
The whole story of, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, is living out the Exodus story, because Jesus goes to Egypt. He escapes to Egypt. So what part of the Exodus story were you thinking of?
Having the children 2 and under being killed.
Yeah.
Because of Pharaoh has happened when Moses is born.
Yeah, he has all the newborns slaughtered. Yes.
Yeah. So one of the other ideas that we have is that there's 3 wise men. That's who show up. Is that how many we have?
It has to be, because the song says we 3 kings.
Yeah.
I'm not going to sing anymore. You can pick it up. It has to be, right? My manger scene always comes with 3. All we know is that there were 3 gifts. And so we assume that there were 3 wise men. Of course, Orthodox tradition, I think they name them. You guys, do you know the names of these guys?
Not Orthodox.
Melchior, something. They have names for the guy. They're known.
Okay.
Which is an interesting thing there. I won't get into that part of the story though. So yeah, hey, 3 wise guys. I'm wise men. I like to call them wise guys.
They must have been Italian then.
Yeah, exactly, because they're one of us. Yeah,
exactly, our people. So we also celebrate this on December 25th, obviously.
Yeah.
This is something where this seems to be like a huge battle for, no, it historically had to be December 25th. And then this is why the Christians get all mad when Starbucks decides to change its cup colors, because in a consumeristic culture, how are you not celebrating Jesus for a whole month? So there's a whole bunch of stuff surrounding December 25th. There's also, from a flip side, from a skeptical standpoint, there could be arguments saying, oh, this is just the paganization of Christianity. I would say Council on Nicaea, I believe it dealt more with the celebration date of Easter. I don't think they talked about Christmas. I need to go back and reread that again.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Yeah, I know they dealt with when to celebrate Easter. But is this something where it was just later adapted as, oh, let's celebrate the birth of Jesus and replace the pagan holidays or of the solstice? And I don't know, where do we come up with December 25th? And more so, is that the hill we want to die on? Could it possibly be something else?
It's very likely something else. Obviously, we have no idea, I would say. Yeah. And if the shepherds were watching their flocks by night, they weren't doing that on December 25th because they wouldn't be out. In that Bethlehem's 3,000 feet almost in elevation. It's cold. It can snow. In Bethlehem. So it's cold there. So that doesn't make any sense. So you have 2 different traditions. One is the popular one that maybe has more historical weight to it, is that Constantine made Christmas the special holiday because that was the pagan feast of the sun, the Saturnalia, and it was to rival. That's been the most popular thesis. I read recently, I was surprised to see this. Michael Bird actually posted that March 25th was the date for the crucifixion of Jesus, which I don't know how he got that date. I think there's a theological tradition of it. I think it actually comes maybe from Tertullian in the late 2nd century, and a few others. So it's not that popular, but March 25th, which is my daughter's birthday, by the way. But I think the best date for the crucifixion of Jesus is April 7th. He was crucified in the year either 30 or 33. So it depends on which date you go with. If you go with the year 30 AD, then Jesus was crucified on April 7th, because that would be the feast of Passover, and then rises on April 9th. So that's how we get our dates. But there's a little bit of a tradition that March 25th was the date of the crucifixion of Jesus. And then there's a tradition that these dates are commonly repeated. And so the idea is that 30 years earlier was the date of the Annunciation of Mary. In other words, the angel comes and tells Mary she's pregnant on March 25th, 30 years earlier. So if you go March 25th and you go 9 months, that's December 25th. And that's the date of his birth. So there's a tradition for that as well. I don't think that tradition is very strong.
Yeah,
I was surprised to see it in Michael Bird's post a couple weeks ago. But I think the date of April 7th is more likely. And perhaps it was December 25th to rival the pagan festival.
Yeah.
So.
And ultimately, this is not something you see the early Christian church make. This wasn't a celebration point. They celebrated the resurrection on a weekly basis. That became like the new festival of the people of God. And so this is a later development. And so is it important that Jesus was born? Absolutely. Is dying on the hill of December 25th something that Christians should do? Probably not.
And there's another hill we shouldn't die on. And I don't know if you noticed, Vinnie, when I texted you the other day, I was very intentional in doing this. I texted you, hey, we should do a thing on Xmas. Did you catch that?
I saw that.
Okay.
Yeah. I even saw it in the notes in here, and I'm like, oh, you put Xmas. Which
I did that very intentionally.
Yes. And so growing up in the 80s, in a fundamentalist environment, it's like if someone puts Xmas, it's because they hate Jesus and they're trying to
take the Christ out of Christmas.
Exactly. But it's funny because
Happy Holidays does the same thing, by the way. You can't
no more holy
holidays is how you love your neighbor.
Yes.
Because if they're not Christian, they're Muslim or Jewish, they're not celebrating Christmas. So you say happy holidays. It's just a way of loving your neighbor. You're not taking Christ out of Christmas. You're actually embodying Christ by loving your neighbor. But really quick, the X is the first letter in Greek. It's a key in the name Christos. And so you'll often see ancient, what's the word I want for this, Vinnie? Where you artistry, or they make icons. That's the word I want.
Oh, icons. Okay.
They're mosaics as well, but iconography. So ancient iconography will often have Jesus, and on one side will be an X for Christos, or it will be like the I for Iota for Iesus, and on the other side will be an X for, and it might even have an S, which is. It's actually a final S in Greek, and it's a little bit different. But it might have like IS on the left side for Iesus, and on the right side it'll have XS, which is key and sigma for Christos. Jesus's name was often abbreviated with the English equivalent of an X. Writing Xmas is shorthand, but they often abbreviated Jesus's name in iconography, and we abbreviate all kinds. You might see A and what looks like a W. It's Alpha and Omega. Oh, so he's the Alpha and the Omega. Yeah, next to Jesus' head. Abbreviating words was very common in the ancient world, and so the X is actually putting Christ in the middle of Christmas. It's just an even way to say
more so, even to look at the majesty of this in a sense. Oftentimes in ancient text, they would abbreviate names, especially sacred names. It's called the nomina sacra, if it's a sacred name. And so they would write just the first letter of that name with a line over it to indicate, hey, instead of writing theos for God, you would just write the theta with a line over it, and that would indicate this is a placeholder for God. And the same thing with Christ. And just using that first letter, that's actually significant even in an ancient biblical tradition of that nomina sacra, in indicating that with a significant name.
Yeah. So the point of having this episode was to simply tell the story of Christ and to give a different perspective and help us understand some of our cultural things. I have a manger scene. It's no problem at all. That's great. You're honoring the baby Jesus, honoring this Christ story, honoring the Advent. You don't need to go to your churches and tell them how this is all wrong. That's fine. They're traditions, but just be careful to assume that our traditions actually replicate what the biblical text actually says, because I think we're leaving key parts out of the story. That's the reason why we had it, namely that the incarnation was in the midst of humanity and that we're called to be an incarnation as well. So here's the deal, Vinnie. I've been processing this for a long time, and I realized recently that 2025, one of the things, so you, myself, and Danny, now the three amigos in Determined Truth, we're all independent contractors in many ways, right? We all work under the umbrella of Determined Truth, but whatever you do doesn't mean that I'm endorsing everything, nor what I do means you're endorsing me, and we're not endorsing Danny's stuff. Just kidding.
The good news is he doesn't even know how to use a podcast, so he's not even going to hear this thing.
I know.
He doesn't know how to
access. Oh, there you go.
Because he's old.
Are you saying it's because he's old? Okay.
Because he's so old.
Yeah. When Danny says he was born in the 50s or whatever year, we have to clarify it's 1950s, because we just kind of get that confused. We love you, Danny, but it's okay. He's not listening to this right now because he's probably falling asleep in this nap time in the middle of the podcast. We got to edit it. We're going to edit all this out, or we're going to leave it in?
No, not at all. Okay. He's like, I'm hungry for oatmeal.
That's because he didn't put his teeth back in for breakfast. Okay. We got to stop, man. We got to stop.
It's too easy.
Yeah. Because if we don't go on, this episode's going to go too long, and the rest of them's going to put him to say it's bedtime.
He's already asleep anyway, man. He's
been dozing off the whole pudding before he goes to bed. So, okay. Anyway, did I say we love you, Danny? Yeah, I hope we did. We do. And we really do mean that. But anyways, I digress. One of the things that I've been convicted of is the need to equip the people of God. So I've been looking at the Gospel of Luke here recently, and Luke chapter 10 has what I think is one of the saddest verses in the scriptures. It says, the harvest is plentiful, Luke 10, verse 2, but the laborers are few. Beseech the Lord of the harvest to send laborers into the harvest. And then the next thing that happens is Jesus goes on to send the 70 out. So here's the deal. We want to stress, at least my aspect of determined truth is going to stress, equipping you to be the laborers to go into the harvest. But there's a very important caveat here. Luke, and the reason why I read Luke's version of this is because Luke 10, verse 3 adds something. It says, go, behold, I'm sending you as lambs in the midst of wolves. Oh, by the way, did we leave that part out? We are equipping you to do the work of the kingdom. But that work of the kingdom is to be lambs in the midst of wolves. And I'm going to be doing some live streams. I'm running some blogs. I have a blog post that will come out probably even before this podcast goes live. It should come out this week as you and I are talking. And this podcast will go out live next week as you and I are talking. In which I'm going to tell my story. And I haven't told my story, most of my story publicly. And I'll figure out how to tell some of it. I guess the word I haven't liked before is deconstructing, but I think it's an appropriate word. I like to use the phrase that I'm reconstructing, not just deconstructing, because we've taken the word deconstructing or deconstruction and made it a negative thing when it's not really a negative thing. And I talked about that a little bit in my blog post that came out last week on determinedtruth.com on the blog tab. And what I've begun to realize is maybe what we're doing in church as a large entity, maybe that's the problem. And I know there are lots of Christians in our churches. There are lots of godly people doing lots of really good things. But I think largely the fabric of evangelicalism, and I'll just use that because that's the tribe that I work in, that I dwell in, I think you as well, has gone astray. And it seems to me that there's a lot of people who are deconstructing. And when we're deconstructing, it doesn't mean that we're like trying to figure out all of Christianity. It's like we haven't left Jesus. That's the whole point. Jesus is that focal point, that center point that we're holding on to and trying to figure out what everything else looks like. And I realize that there's thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even more Christians, even evangelicals who are doing this. And I really think that my call for the next year is to use my voice to speak to them and say, maybe you're meeting in small groups in homes because you just can't go to churches any longer, like my story, which I'll reveal over the course of the next couple of months. And so let's provide them resources so that they can have small group Bible studies and small group church gatherings and small group koinonias or fellowships with some resources for understanding the scriptures, contemplating the scriptures, having social time, fellowship time, and just working through the text. So I'm going to be doing some live streams in January, February, March, and thereafter, designed really to meet that small group Bible study or maybe that small home group church and say, here you go. Here's content that you can use to then talk about, and we'll have questions and you can pause the recording and then discuss and maybe come back to the recording next week and finish it up or whatever. And then I'll be doing a lot of blog posts on this as well. And even with our podcast, I think we've started to do this a little bit, just focusing on things and letting people know, hey, we're grappling with some of the same things that you are. So that's where I'm going in 2025. And this part of the story is kind of part of it. We've taken the Jesus story and we've commercialized it and we've individualized it and we've consumerized it so that it's about Jesus being humble and therefore so shall you be. And I think we've missed so much of the story. So that's my speech for the day. Anything you want to add?
Actually, just going off of your goals, and like you said, me and Danny have been meeting over the last number of weeks to be strategic about next year. You and I are actually, once we finish this, we're going to be meeting and talking about this. One of our goals is to expand the reach of determined truth and what we can do. And so we're being very deliberate about that. So part of this is literally needing to partner with the people who are listening right now. And we know there's a number of you. And so there's a couple different ways that we actually could use your help, because this is, in all intents and purposes, this is going to be the last time we talk to you in 2024. And so there's different types of needs. They're all equally important. Obviously, like there's a financial aspect of us needing to continue to raise funds to survive. And so we are a 501c3. You can go to the determinedtruth.com and click on the give tab and give. There's a number of you who are already regular givers. A number of you have done one-time gifts, and we're so appreciative of those.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. We don't take that
Amen.
lightly.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for giving and supporting, for not only in 2024, but in other years that you've done that as well. Other ways that you could help out, though, is say maybe you're not in a position where you can give, and not everyone is. Do us a favor. Like, seriously, there's things that you can do to be a huge part of this. And this isn't ego boost stuff. It's just, this is what it takes to expand our reach. Like we talk about leaving reviews on things like the podcast app. Do that. Like, that seriously helps get that. The way the algorithms work. Leave a review, leave 5 stars if you think it's 5-star worthy. That helps more people see it. It gives it a little boost. So seriously, if you're like, hey, I can't give anything, you can do that though. You could go in your podcast app and give a review. Go onto our YouTube channels and subscribe and like videos. Like things like this help, because it kicks up the content into those platforms and allows other people to see them. And then we could also say, hey, share these things with people. Talk to people about these podcasts you listen to, and say, hey, maybe your goal for it, seriously, you're in this with us. So you guys, we're talking to you guys. You are our partners in this. Make it a goal. Say, hey, I'm going to try to get one person a month to listen to the podcast, or I'm going to get one person a month to watch the videos that we do, or whatever. That stuff seriously helps. You are instrumental in getting this out here. And we're doing stuff on our end where we've been having serious conversations about how can we improve content. We've hired an agency to come in and help give us input on what we could do better. Like, we're trying to do this, but it's you guys are as integral in helping us out. So we would really say, hey, do this with us, partner with us truly, and help make this thing get out to more folks, because we believe in it. We think we're doing good content, and it's a good message that folks need to hear.
Absolutely, Vinnie. Thank you so much for that. And just to reiterate, I don't like doing this. I don't think any of us like doing this, but the financial concerns are real. We're at a point where we really have to evaluate soon whether or not we can actually sustain this, as if it's viable or not. And so your support, $10 a month or $10 million a month, obviously that would help, would go a long way toward helping us make that decision, that judgment. Obviously, we could use your prayers. Sign up for the newsletter. Go to determinedtruth.com and subscribe there for the newsletter. Subscribing on determinedtruth.com is not the same as subscribing on Patheos for the blog. Subscribing for the blog means you get an email whenever there's a blog. Subscribing for the newsletter means you get usually once a month, I issue a newsletter. Kind of, here's what's going on at Determined Truth with a 1-minute video. Letting people know what's going on and supporting what we're doing, and then also giving us feedback, like, okay, hey, I'm deconstructing also, or here's where I'm at, or here's what my church is at. Can you guys provide resources that cover this? Can you address this? Can you address that? Give us content, give us things that you want to hear about, so that we can help produce some of that content, invite guests on the podcast, discuss these things as we go through the gospel, the book of Galatians, or go through, any of the other writings of the New Testament. Or we can do live streams to focus on a particular issue or issues. Absolutely. Please help us, because we are all partners in this as well. And the thing I would add would be being individuals who have been, I'll speak for myself, Vinnie, who've been traumatized, who've been hurt by the church, and trying to do something that we're trying to do doesn't pay, because churches they don't want to hear it. And so they don't hire us. They don't want to hear the voice. And so as a result, we have to go 501c3 nonprofit. And so that's one of the reasons why we especially need the support, is that we can't do this inside an institution. An institution either won't let us do it, or an institution won't hire us and let us do it. So amen. Yeah. None of this is on the notes. We didn't intend to talk about any of this, but it's necessary. It's part of the gig. So absolutely. Thanks so much.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Well, hey, I hope you all have a great holiday season.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Xmas.
Merry Xmas. And now it's not a bad word. It's okay.
It's not. It's very Christ-centered. So,
yes.
All right, take care, Vinnie.
Yep, Rob, I will see you much later in the new year. I definitely will not see you immediately when we stop this to talk about planning for the new year. But
no, we don't have a meeting in 5 minutes.
No.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Catch you guys later. Bye.
I want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast, and we would love for you to share the work of Determined Truth with others. Please follow this podcast and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your review will go a long way towards helping others find this podcast. Then share it with others so that we can get the word of the gospel of the kingdom to more people.